Well, that is the key criticism of my book. People would say, oh, come on, the government can't be that smart to organize all this stuff. But I point out in the book, the government can't be this dumb to do so many stupid things along the way that pushed up the price of oil to $150 a barrel and do nothing to stop it. It had to have been an intentional policy. It's what I call the dog that didn't bark syndrome, from the Sherlock Holmes story. The government sat back and did nothing as that price ran up, sat on their hands. And what's more important is in the 1980s, there's a paper trail documented. People from the Reagan National Security Council came out of the woodwork and bragged about how they busted the Russians, the Soviets, with low oil prices back then. So we've done it before. We can do it again. We're good at it. In fact, a lot of the same people who were in that Reagan National Security Council, they're the guys on Cheney's staff now. I mean, they're just doing what comes naturally. I think they have a fairly limited playbook of stuff that they know how to do well, and moving oil prices around is high on the list.
It's a touchdown pass for them, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's not a Hail Mary either. I mean, they know how to do this. In fact, actually, talking about Hail Mary, let me just mention Iraq, how Iraq fits into this. I mentioned this in the book. We've never had a decent explanation out of Washington as to why we invaded Iraq, let alone Afghanistan.
Weapons of mass destruction, James.
Yeah, or Al-Qaeda. But look, all this stuff is baloney. The real reason we went in there, and I just state this flat out, is because of China. When Saddam was still in control, he had started to do deals with the Chinese and other countries to actually sell them the rights to oil in the ground, equity reserves in the ground, not just tanker loads of crude, but actually ownership of the reserves in the ground.
For big dollars.
Well, yeah, actually what it was is for the commitment of those countries to come in and develop those fields, turn them into cash for him, so he wouldn't have to spend his own money. Now,
and that's literally his own money, right?
Well, yeah, in effect. But as long as UN sanctions were in place, those countries couldn't come in and touch those fields. But they were due to expire at the end of 2003. That's when the UN sanctions would have been lifted. And at that point, the Chinese were preparing to move probably tens of thousands of, quote, oil field workers into essentially garrison at least one, probably two, and maybe many more very large oil fields there. Once you had Chinese boots on the ground in Iraq, the whole game would change. No longer
Absolutely.
could we go in and just bomb them whenever we felt like. I mean, and worse than that, that would be actually a direct violation of what's called the Carter Doctrine, which actually came into existence during Jimmy Carter's reign. 1980, the big Newt Brzezinski enunciated it. Basically said this: if any outside power moves to gain control of Middle East oil reserves, the United States will regard that as a direct threat to our national security and will respond militarily if necessary.
And interesting that Brzezinski is going to attach himself to Obama, and so he'll still be hanging around.
Well, this is my point. What I say in this book, it's really not a Democrat-Republican thing. It's not a left-right kind of thing. This whole thing is driven by a national security agenda, and there's really, look, the national security mindset, this juggernaut just rolls on regardless of which cardboard cutout you've got standing up reading the teleprompter on those presidential speeches.
Well, and James, is it national security or is it national greed for a few?
It's probably hard to tell the difference between that. I think they're in their own minds, they could probably confuse that very well.
Because, I see what's happening now around this country with these massive layoffs, jobs being cut, worldwide now. Alcoa just announced 13,500 cutbacks. But the greedy few at the top are going to make a lot of money on this. This bailout money that they won't tell us where it's gone, who gets it, why. I mean, it's the biggest sham I've ever seen, and it continues.
Yeah, but the way they're able to rationalize it, I'm convinced, is under the auspices of national security. I mean, that's their all-purpose rationale for doing whatever they want to do, and it's potent. It's very powerful. And as I point out in the book, in this oil price manipulation scheme, it's really the question becomes, who in the government does this? What I note in the book is that it was the National Security Council in the 80s that did it. Now there is what's called the President's Working Group on Financial Markets, the so-called Plunge Protection Team. It's headed by the Secretary of the Treasury, got the head of the SEC, Commodity Futures Trading Commission, Federal Reserve New York. On an ad hoc basis, it's also got the heads of the NYMEX, the New York Stock Exchange, the Amex. To my way of thinking, it's this group now, which is really the economic warfare equivalent of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. These guys call the shots, and they command significant amounts of forces in the form of basically government slush funds, mainly managed by the New York Federal Reserve, which is why it's interesting to me that Obama's picked Tim Geithner to come in as his Treasury Secretary. Geithner's been running the New York Fed. I mean, he's been a point man on a lot of this stuff.
They're all the same, James. They're all the same. It's a team.
Yeah.
It's been a team for a long time. I had an astrologer on who deals with financial and global politics. And he said last night, he said, nothing's changed. These are the same folks that have been around for 40 years. And they just keep plodding along.
Well, yeah, I think that because it is a national security elite, there's really a limited pool of people to draw from for these jobs. That's why you keep seeing Leon Panetta's name showing up.
No intelligence experience, and he's running the CIA soon.
Well, you see, you don't know what role he's had in intelligence matters in years past. I mean, he's had various titles, never overtly with the CIA, but, I mean, when he was in the Clinton White House, he was certainly had high-level security clearances. I mean, my working hypothesis is the people who really call the shots on these things are not the ones that you see on TV or who become household names. I mean, it's a deep bureaucracy of people and talent there, I guess you'd call it talent, that go on doing this stuff.
I get into a massive argument on this show with a guest, Matt Sevenar, who's a believer in peak oil. He says, we've peaked, it's coming down, and this planet is running out of oil. I, on the other hand, I'm a believer of the abiotic oil theory, James. I believe this planet produces it in abundance. I do not believe on the simple fossil fuel theory. There's just way too much oil on this planet to believe that. I don't think this planet will run out of oil in our lifetime.
Right, I think you're right. You're right. We're going to run out of demand long before we run out of oil. But you have to think of this peak oil mantra, again, as part of this economic warfare effort.
Now, he believes this, though. He believes this.
A lot of people believe it. And the proponents of it, I'm sure they believe it themselves. But nevertheless, this whole peak oil thing has been used as a propaganda bludgeon to try and it's necessary. You know, as Churchill said, that in times of war, truth can only go anywhere protected with a bodyguard of lies. Well, peak oil is one of these lies, and it's basically, in order to get the price up and keep it up, you've got to convince the world we're running out of oil. And so this peak oil thing, this theory's been around for decades, but they drag this out and dust it off and embellish it. What's interesting, though, is that one of the key proponents of this is Matt Simmons, who's an investment banker down in Houston. I know Matt. In fact, I wrote one of the first stories about him at Business Week when I was in Houston in the 80s. At that time, he was preaching exactly the opposite gospel, saying oil prices will never recover, they'll always be low, and by the way, you better hire my firm to merge your oil field service companies together to save your money. So, I mean, he may be completely sincere. Unfortunately, he's inherently conflicted in some of this stuff, and he's changed his tune. He says he had a great epiphany in the early 90s, noting that the Saudis were going to run out of oil. Well, in fact, none of these predictions have been true. The Saudis still have plenty of oil on the ground. They just announced 3 new discoveries today. They have ample unused production capacity. The Saudis are not about to run out of oil. There's lots more oil being found. I'm actually on your side on the abiotic oil thing. I think the Earth's core, it's always churning, it's grinding, it's basically generating all kinds of hydrogen, helium, carbon dioxide, gases that are venting to the surface. And as those gases come to the surface, they combine with carbon, you get hydrocarbons. You bake them into long chains, you get petroleum.